Hey guys, what's up? It's Nancy with T-Cell Logic. So today our case is about the Saint Valentines Day murders, which took place in Chicago, Illinois, back in the 1920s. The crime that became known as the Saint Valentines Day Massacre occurred on February 14, 1929, on the north side of Chicago, Illinois. Two of the assailants that day were dressed as police officers, which adds a lot of mystery to the case and made it very difficult to find out who exactly was responsible for this heinous crime. In 1920, the United States passed the 18th Amendment, which prohibited the manufacture, importation, and sale of alcohol. This created a massive demand for booze, especially for those millions of people who had absolutely no intention of giving up alcohol. Organized crime saw this as a perfect opportunity to fill the void, and it created a very profitable black market, which was known as bootlegging. There was such a high demand for alcohol that bootlegging became a million-dollar enterprise. You would see your average Joes turning into millionaires being bootleggers. So these organized crime groups smuggled alcohol in from Canada or other countries, or sometimes it was homemade. They usually sold this illegal alcohol inside of underground bars, speakeasies, and nightclubs, which at the time were extremely popular, especially Chicago, which in the 1920s was known as the bootlegging capital of the United States. With millions of dollars waiting to be made, competition was fierce. And with this high demand often came turf wars, hijacking of alcohol shipments, and a lot of times the gangs involved in this activity armed themselves with weapons and often turned to violence to settle disputes. One of the strongest gangs at the time was the South Side Gang, which was led by the famous Al Capone. Al took first place in being the most violent crime bosses around, and he was known to use extreme violence to get rid of whoever was in his way. Al Capone was determined to control the entire city of Chicago, or better yet, he was determined to control the entire Midwest. One man that was definitely in Al Capone's way was George Bugs Moran. Bugs controlled a big part of the north side illegal bootlegging in Chicago, and he ran most of the illegal brothels and casinos. So, the St. Valentine's Day Massacre happened on February 14th, 1929 at about 10:30 a.m. at the SMC Carthage Garage on 2122 North Clark Street on the north side of Chicago. It was being rented out by George Bugs Moran, and the dark garage with a single lit light bulb stored cars and trucks. So one interesting question about this case is, why were these men at the garage so early in the morning? These guys were night owls, and oftentimes they would not be awake so early in the morning because they would be asleep from getting home so late at night the previous night. Well, technically, the reason is unknown. This case remains unresolved, and I honestly do not see it being solved anytime soon. First of all, because it is a closed case, and second of all, it happened a really long time ago, and a lot of these people are no longer alive. But let's speculate. It is believed that these 7 men, who were all part of the Bugs Moran bootlegging business, were at the garage possibly waiting for a shipment of alcohol from Canada that they were going to get at a good deal. What's interesting though is that the men were all dressed really fancy. They had ties, tie pins, fancy shoes, and one of them even had a carnation in his coat pocket. Except the mechanic, Johnny May. He was wearing his usual greasy overalls. That morning, he was lying underneath the car where he was fixing a wheel. Johnny used to be a safe blower who was then hired as a mechanic by Bugs Moran. He lived with his wife and his 7 kids in Chicago. And he also had a German Shepherd named Highball, who was actually at the garage the day of the massacre. He was tied up on the bumper of a car by Johnny while he worked. Also there on that day were the two Gusenberg brothers, Frank and Peter, who were two well-known Chicago troublemakers. James Clark, or his real name Albert Kochelik, was a convicted armed robber and killer. Adam Hay, aka Frank Snyder, was an accountant and an embezzler. Albert Weinshank, owner of a nightclub and official of the Central Cleaners and Dyers Association. Also there was Reinhard Schwimmer, a wannabe gangster and an optometrist. Reinhardt liked to brag to his friends about how he hung out with the bad boys like Bugs Moran. So, not long after the men arrived at the garage, witnesses say that they saw 4 or 5 men arrive in a black Cadillac and park outside the garage on North Clark Street, which, based on witness testimony, looked like a police car that police officers drove back in the day. The driver of the Cadillac wore a chinchilla topcoat, and 2 of the men were wearing police uniforms. So on that day, all of Bug's men who were there had weapons with them, so they could have easily defended themselves, but they didn't. When the assailants went into the garage, they ordered all 7 men to line up shoulder to shoulder against the wall in the garage. And the reason I mentioned that they all had weapons on them that day is because it didn't seem like the 7 men put up a fight at all. Anyway, all 7 men were sprayed with bullets from Thompson submachine guns and a shotgun, and streams became puddles of dark, thick blood. And there was a drain not too far from where the men landed, so their blood was draining down that drain. All of the men died instantly, except for one of the Gusenberg brothers, Frank. He was still hanging on by a thread. He would, however, eventually die at the hospital. His German Shepherd Highball did survive the massacre. So these 7 men, all victims of this unsolved Saint Valentine's Day massacre. Also, the 7 men all had tons of cash on them, and the assailants who shot them did not take any of that cash. All the money was still in their pockets, so it's clear that robbery was not the motive, because it's not like they couldn't pay off whoever was trying to attack them. But that's not what happened. This massacre made way for a lot of changes in the United States at the time. So Bugs Moran, who was supposed to be at the garage that morning, was not there when the men were shot. He was running late that morning, and when he was getting close to the garage, he noticed that there was a police car outside of the garage. So he decided to avoid the garage and ended up going to a nearby coffee shop instead. Neighbors out on Clark Street heard popping sounds, and they also heard the sounds of Highball howling. A few neighbors glanced out their window just in time to see the assailants coming out of the garage. And witnesses said that they saw 2 police officers leading 2 men out of the garage with guns pointed at their head. They got into the black Cadillac and they sped off towards Armitage Avenue. So curious neighbors made their way to the garage. The first ones to arrive on the scene saw that smoke filled the air and they could smell the blood. One of them saw that Frank was still alive. One of the first officers on the scene was Officer Tom Loftus. When he saw Frank on the ground, hanging on to life, he went over and asked him if he knew who he was. He said, "Yes, you're Tom Loftus." Frank assured Officer Loftus that he would not be talking. Even though he said he wouldn't talk, after a few breaths of air, Frank decided to tell Officer Loftus that the cops did it, but he didn't give any more details aside from that. Gusenberg was not ready to die. He begged for someone to get him to the hospital as soon as possible. Unfortunately for Frank, he would end up dying after arriving at the hospital. So Americans never really warmed up to the idea of prohibition, but they weren't exactly out doing anything about it. That as long as they were able to get their alcohol fix, they didn't really care. even if it meant counting on bootleggers to get them their alcohol. Prohibition made millionaire celebrities out of gangsters like Al Capone, and it allowed of corruption of the justice system. So Americans tolerated the violence because it was mostly between the gangs attacking other rival gangs. This would change though. The Saint Valentines Day Massacre made people reconsider, and they started thinking about what was really happening during this prohibition. The slaughtering of 7 men, with newspapers publishing the bloody, gory pictures, was just too much for people to handle. It shook them to the core. During that time, Herbert Hoover, who was the president-elect, had pledged to clean up the justice system, and he was determined to find out who had committed this heinous crime in Chicago. And Hoover and a lot of people at that time really thought that Al Capone was behind this hit. Al Capone had a reputation, and this crime definitely fit his reputation. To those in his group, Al Capone was known as Big Fellow, Scarface, or as most people knew him, Public Enemy Number One. Those within Al Capone's group knew that this was not the work of Al Capone, and so did those that were working for Hoover in Chicago. A lot of the world still believes that Capone had something to do with this massacre. And the refusal to acknowledge that Al Capone was not responsible for this massacre is one of the main reasons that the crime went unsolved. The feds never wanted to hear anything about any other suspects or any other theories that were presented to them about who or what or why this crime took place. It was revenge by someone who was not Al Capone. Or during the crime, Al Capone was in Dade County, Florida, and he was there for an interview with a prosecutor from Brooklyn, New York, who was there investigating the death of one of Al Capone's good friends, Frank Yale. And during that time, Al Capone knew that his finances were being investigated by the feds, but because there was no IRS representative at the meeting, he didn't feel like he needed to defend himself or bring a lawyer with him. And by this time, the super violent photos of the massacre were making the rounds. But Al Capone didn't sweat it. He had an alibi. He was in Florida. But people were pissed. This crime had gone too far. They were sick of prohibition and the tragedies that came with it. Assigned to prosecute Al Capone was Chicago's U.S. Attorney George E.Q. Johnson, who called this massacre the most amazing crime in Chicago's amazing criminal history. Detectives, police officers, and even newspapermen went all around the north side of Chicago looking for witnesses, for anyone who saw anything. Maybe they saw the black Cadillac, but they couldn't find anyone who saw anything. Was Capone responsible for the killing? It was a fact that Moran and Capone were competitors in the bootlegging business. But surely Moran had a bunch of other enemies that wasn't just Capone. Surely if these assailants were there for Bugs Moran, maybe it wasn't a hit on Bugs Moran though. Maybe they were there for the Gusenberg brothers, who were 2 big troublemakers in Chicago. Maybe they did something to someone and they were out to get them. Or maybe it was something less complicated. Maybe it had something to do with the bootlegging business. It wasn't unusual for someone to hijack the bootleg alcohol supply, or even using threats to try to get owners of speakeasies or bars to switch suppliers. This happened often, and more times than not, it ended in violence. Or it's possible that Frank Gusenberg's last words were the missing piece of the puzzle. Some of the witnesses that day say that the police car they saw parked outside the garage did look like a police car. Another theory is that the Purple Gang from Detroit, Michigan may have had something to do with it. It would have been in retaliation for a recent hijacking of a shipment of whiskey that happened, and they supposedly rented a room across the street from the garage where it is said that they were watching Bugs Moran and his guys. There's also the theory that maybe it had something to do with a recent election for alderman, where Al Capone was for one alderman candidate and Moran was for the other alderman candidate. Or maybe it had something to do with dry cleaning rackets. After all, Albert Weinshank was involved in the laundry business after all. So, plausible. Another interesting one is that maybe it was Moran. Maybe he ordered a hit on his own guys. Maybe he was annoyed with the Gusenberg brothers and wanted them gone. But I'm not sure about this one. The other theories sound a lot more plausible than this one, but never say never. Okay, so 1 week after the killings, the black Cadillac that was seen outside the garage on that day was found. It had been completely stripped out and burned to a char. Even with this important piece of evidence that they happened to stumble upon, David Stansberry complained that he could think of 50 different motives for this crime, but that none of those motives really stood out as the reason for killing the 7 men. One thing that David Stansberry was pretty positive about was that Al Capone did not have anything to do with this crime. So the next person police had their eyes on was a guy by the name of Machine Gun Jack McGurn. Machine Gun Jack was always considered a suspect whenever shots were heard in the city of Chicago. They automatically thought maybe Machine Gun Jack has something to do with this. So they figured it'd be a good idea to touch base with Machine Gun Jack. You never know, maybe he knows something. But when police approached Machine Gun Jack, he had absolutely no worries at all. Me, mixed up in that gang killing? Don't make me laugh. The Gusenberg brothers would have plugged me if they saw me from a block away. When a reporter from the Evening Star asked Machine Gun Jack who he thought was responsible for the killings, he immediately said the coppers. But to investigators, this didn't make much sense. It doesn't explain why the men got together that morning and they were all dressed so fancy. And been there on time. And if it was actually the police that committed this crime, why would they do it in this fashion? Why wouldn't they just do it like they usually would, which involved arresting them and then saying that they tried running away so they had to shoot them? And why kill Johnny May, the mechanic? Also, Reinhard H. Swimmer, the wannabe gangster, they were both innocent. They didn't deserve to die, really. Not that any of them deserved to die, but they were definitely the innocent ones in this situation. What were they so angry about that they felt they needed to kill these people in that manner? They pretty much didn't even care who they were shooting. Anyway, let's go back to other theories. Let's just say it was gang retaliation for stealing of a shipment of whiskey, the Purple Gang. Why wouldn't they have emptied the pockets of the men to recompensate for some of the lost money? The 7 men were loaded with money, but none of it was taken. You could say it definitely was not a robbery. Once Herbert Hoover took office, he was quick to ask about the investigation into the Saint Valentines Day Massacre, and more specifically, how it was going against Al Capone. Hoover was set on the belief that if he could arrest Al Capone, it would show that he was serious about enforcing the law and he was not playing around. But it didn't quite work out that way. The only update he received from the U.S. Attorney, George E.Q. Johnson, was that they did not have enough evidence to indict Al Capone. The only thing that he thought might work in getting Al Capone indicted was for contempt of court, for a trial previous to this one where Al Capone had his doctor write a note to the court saying that he was too sick to attend, which they figured he wasn't actually sick, and that would be considered contempt of court because he wasn't actually sick and his doctor basically lied for him. The stakes were high in this case, and he was afraid that people would look down on him for only being able to indict Capone on perjury charges. He felt that he could get something better, so he decided to wait. Hoover and Johnson could have charged Capone as an accessory to murder. At least that would have required him to go to court, where they could ask him questions about this case. Hoover and Johnson did not have enough evidence to lay these charges on Capone, and they didn't want to play dirty, not even with Al Capone. Okay guys, I'm so sorry that the lighting and everything keeps changing in this video, but I'm just having such a hard time with my laptop and my cameras. One day I will have this perfected. Getting back to the case. So as much as U.S. Attorney Johnson wanted to save himself the humiliation, it ended up happening anyway. Al Capone was arrested in the state of Philadelphia for carrying a gun, and he was arrested for 1 year. Let's fast forward to December 14, 1929, when Fred Killer Burke crashed his car into a police station in St. Joseph, Michigan. So when the police tried to arrest him, he shot the officer, and that officer ended up dying. Manhunt took place in Stevensville, Michigan, which is where he lived. They were unable to find him. They did end up searching his house. And at his house, they ended up finding the mother load of guns. 2 machine guns, 7 revolvers, 11 tear gas canisters. They did ballistic tests on all the weapons, and to their surprise, Burke's guns were the same ones that were used in the Saint Valentines Day Massacre. And get ready for this one of them was used in the assassination of Frank Yale, which was Al Capone's longtime friend. It gets even crazier, because you would think that police would jump all over this opportunity to question him. Well, that never happened. He was never questioned about either one of the crimes. Not the fact that those guns were used in the massacre, and not the fact that that gun or one of the guns was used in the assassination of Frank Yale in New York City, which is just mind-boggling. Anyway, he was eventually caught and arrested for the murder of the police officer in St. Joseph, Michigan. He was sentenced to life in prison for that crime. But just 9 years later, he would die in prison of a heart attack. Definitely a lost opportunity. This guy ended up dying. You know how much information he would have had? Like, it's just so crazy that they would not question him. It seems that the police really wanted to nail this one on Al Capone, and even if they couldn't, legally speaking, they wanted it to cloud his name. They wanted it to cloud his image. So nothing really happened in the investigation until about January 1935, when an already incarcerated Brian Bolton wanted to cut a deal and reduce his time in jail, and tells investigators that he knows who committed the St. Valentines Day Massacre. He said that it was Killer Burke and 4 other guys. He worked as the lookout, and it was Capone who had ordered the hit, specifically to kill Bugs Moran. This story doesn't really add up. Why would Capone hire so many guys for an assassination that was a one-man job? Capone knew exactly where Bugs lived. He could have had one of his usual gunmen, like Machine Gun Jack, camp outside on the street, wait for Bugs to go outside, and shoot him. Capone already had the feds tracking him. Why would he order a whole squad for this? In addition, if it was Capone who put this hit out, it was a complete disaster because they didn't even get Bugs. Why wouldn't he have his men try again? Bugs was still alive, and if what this Bolton guy is saying is true, why wouldn't they use that testimony to charge Capone? Again, another no-brainer in my opinion, but they didn't. Nothing came of it, except maybe something did come of it. A Chicagoan named Frank T. Farrell read Bolton's testimony, which led him to writing a letter to John Edgar Hoover, head of the FBI, not the president, head of the FBI at that time. On January 28, 1935, he wrote a letter to the police saying that he had information that he felt might be helpful to the investigation. What's interesting is that his account of what supposedly happened was only recently discovered in the FBI archives, and it had never been heard before. And it really does make the most sense out of all the theories that have been presented. His version of events seems to offer the most sensible, logical explanation of the crime so far. In his letter, Farrell said that he had done his own investigation into this crime and that his investigation did take place when that crime occurred, so it was within that time. He said that if federal agents were to check the logbooks for the Chicago Police Department for November of 1928, they would find a 40-year-old firefighter named William Davern Jr., son of Chicago Police Sergeant, had been shot during a bar fight in November of 1928. Davern being shot during that bar fight would be key to unraveling the Valentine's Day Massacre. So this William Davern character had been in the kitchen of the CO restaurant on North Clark in Chicago. This CO restaurant was a popular hangout spot for gangsters when all of a sudden a fight broke out and William Davern ended up being shot in the stomach. After being shot, bloody and all, he was stuffed in a car and driven to the corner of Hubbard Street, and he was thrown out and he was left to die out on the street. Davern managed to crawl all the way down to a fire station call booth, which back in the day were little boxes that were on the side of the street where you could call for help. He ended up crawling there and he called for help. He was transported to the hospital where he would remain for 1 month before ultimately passing away from his injuries. Davern never told police who had shot him. He refused to talk. But one person he did tell was his very close friend and cousin, William White. William and William grew up together in Chicago. They were best buds, and he was pretty much the only person he could trust. Davern ended up telling White a number of different names who all belonged to the Bugs Moran gang. And in those names were the Gusenberg brothers. We all know they were a bunch of troublemakers. He told White, "Those are the guys who shot me." William White, who was also known as Three Finger Jack, the reason he was called Three Finger Jack is because two of the fingers on his right hand had been severed during a botched safe cracking job. He was known as a vicious criminal in Chi-Town with a lengthy record to go along with it to prove it. When Davern died, Three Finger Jack was committed to avenge his cousin William's murder. It's pretty interesting how he ended up going about avenging his murder. If it's actually what happened, I really do think this is the theory, the one that makes the most sense as well. Three Finger Jack contacted one of the Gusenberg brothers. He called him up and he said that he had plans on holding up a factory for their payroll money and he needed some guys to help him complete the job. The reason he called the Gusenberg brother is because it's very likely that Three Finger Jack knew both the Gusenberg brothers. It's believed that they worked together back in 1926 in the robbery of the International Harvesting Company on 31st Street, where they would steal $80,000. So in that robbery, there were 8 men who helped carry it out. Three Finger Jack discovered that one of the guys was ratting them out to the police and giving them information. Three Finger Jack ordered for 2 of his guys to dress up as police officers and murder the snitch while he slept, which sounds familiar. White had this theory that people tended to trust police officers and that as soon as they saw an individual with a police officer uniform, they would completely forget about any distinguishing facial features and, feel comfortable talking to police because they felt that they could be trusted. They're in a uniform, there's nothing to worry about. White was friends with a good deal of crooked cops. He even had family in the police force. For example, his uncle, Sergeant William J. Davern, who worked for the Chicago Police Department, and he was also the father of William Davern, the one who was shot at the CO restaurant and ended up dying. It's very interesting. Now that we've gone over those theories, which one is it? Who committed this horrendous crime? Well, let's go over and get a clear picture of what exactly could have happened. without having to do mental aerobics. Why were there so many men, so nicely dressed, so early in the morning at Bugs Moran's garage? Well, they were there to help Three Finger Jack with the robbery, the payroll robbery of the factory. So why didn't they defend themselves against the assailants that morning? You would think that they would have done something. I mean, they were all carrying weapons and had the means to defend themselves. Well, it's because they were expecting someone that morning. Remember, they were set to help Three Finger Jack out with that payroll robbery at the factory. So that's probably who they were waiting for that morning. This was not a robbery of Moran and his guys. They didn't want their money. They wanted revenge. Revenge for the murder of William Davern, who was shot in the stomach, driven to the corner of Hubbard Avenue, and dumped on the street to die. And he ended up dying a month later. It was personal, yet it didn't really matter who they killed. The motive was emotional enough and powerful enough for William White to commit this heinous crime to avenge his best friend, his most trusted childhood friend. It was to avenge his murder. William Davern was a victim of some of the guys that were friends with Bugs Moran. This theory helps explain the lack of investigation into the Saint Valentines Day Massacre. There were so many lost opportunities to interview Machine Gun Jack regarding the weapons that he had that were used in the massacre and in the murder of Frank Yale. The lack of interest in finding the actual culprit. It seemed that they really just wanted to nail this one on Al Capone and didn't really care, who was actually responsible for this massacre. Because it was the police who were involved. They were all in on it. One of their own had lost his son to Bugs Moran's gang. The police department knew that this was done in retaliation. Sergeant Davern, William Davern's dad, would have been the one to provide the police uniforms because it wouldn't have been a problem for him to get his hands on police uniforms. And he also had access to police cars. Remember, there was a black Cadillac that morning that looked exactly like a police car at the time. This crime just went political. The U.S. attorney and President Hoover insisted on pointing their fingers at Al Capone, who could be used as a poster child, essentially, for Hoover, who was just so set on cleaning up the justice system. If Three Finger Jack were to confess to carrying out this crime, in retaliation nonetheless, news reporters would have immediately known that Sergeant Davern would have been involved one way or another. I mean, his son was killed. How would he have been involved? Well, he would have covered up the crime, which would then go back to Frank Gusenberg's last words before he died, where he said that the coppers did it. That would, all link up. Another really interesting piece of information that seemed pretty insignificant at the time was that one of the witnesses on that day had seen the black Cadillac arrive in front of the garage, which he thought was a police car. And the car arrived and had 5 men inside. The driver ended up staying inside the car and he had his hand on the wheel. This witness specifically remembered the man was missing a finger or two, which sounds like it was Three Finger Jack. The witness said that the driver's hand was stretched out so that it was super obvious that the guy was missing some of his fingers. But police didn't care. They didn't look into this clue. They just shrugged it off. Freedom of Information documents reveal that William White ended up becoming a federal informant, giving up information about Chicago hoodlums in exchange for their protection, which is interesting because he had one of his guys killed for being a rat and snitching some of his guys out for a previous crime. If the FBI's John Edgar Hoover knew that William White was involved, they would have helped cover up his involvement in order not to lose him as an informant. This didn't last long though. In January 1934, guys that William Davern was associating with ended up finding out that he was an FBI informant. William Three Finger Jack was executed at his home. Federal agents were seen leaving his home shortly before he was killed. No one has been arrested for his murder. Eventually, when the FBI's Hoover received a letter from Frank Farrell, he didn't care. To him, the case was closed. He ended up referring him to the local police department. It's interesting that he wouldn't want information regarding an unsolved crime, one of the most amazing crimes in Chicago's amazing criminal history. About Al Scarface Capone, did he really have something to do with this massacre? I have to say that I highly doubt it. As Chicago Magazine puts it, he was punished for it. Capone had the feds after him. He was a poster child for criminal power, and his imprisonment became a priority. Al Capone was never charged for the Saint Valentines Day Massacre. He was eventually charged with felony tax evasion. Not any of his robberies, not any of his murders, illegal bootlegging, income tax evasion. He was sentenced to 11 years in prison. Capone called it a blow to the belt. While in prison, Capone gave many interviews. He often spoke about his regrets and said that he wished he hadn't been so friendly with the media because this ended up getting them to target him. Lawyers had failed him and that the judge presiding over his case was unfair. He apologized for the pain and suffering that he had caused his wife and his son. To finish off this case, Al Capone never talked about the St. Valentine's Day Massacre, the crime that was so massive and so heinous that it essentially ended his career as a boss man. You would think that if he was involved, he'd have at least something to say about the case, but he never really talked about it. When Al Capone was released from prison, it was clear as day that he was no longer the boss man. He no longer had the power that he did at one point in time. He came out of prison suffering with syphilis, which would ultimately kill him. I'm not trying to imply that Al Capone was a saint or that he was innocent or that we should have sympathy for him. It just happens that Al Capone was not involved in this particular theory. I'm sure he was guilty of a lot of other crimes. Thank you for sticking around if you're still here. I appreciate each and every one of you. Let me know what you think happened. Do you think Al Capone was involved? Do you think this feral guy held the secret to what exactly did happen? Let me know in the comments what you think. I'd be really interested to hear what y'all think. Yeah, that does it for this case. I hope to see you next time, and please take care.